So when the framers set up our presidency, some had the sense that the president should act more like a temporary monarch, a constitutional monarch. Lucas, what do you think of this? There are some people who are thinking that this is actually the way the presidency is supposed to operate, and that Trump is actually pursuing this type of way of governing.
I think there were framers who wanted the American system to be modeled on Europe's monarch, but there was that argument that was held at the Constitutional Convention. They lost. They lost the idea that the federal government, which we call the federal government in the wake of that argument, because it's not a national argument. And so while I agree that they set up the power structure of the federal government to give a great deal of power to the leader, to the, as they called it, the executive, our chief executive, haha. They also limited the powers of that government, and they limited it to commerce, largely commerce, and to settle disputes between the states. And we have been walking back that limitation of federalism, or that limitation of nationalism. And nationalism goes to the control over the bodies of the people that reside within the bounds of jurisdiction, and also the resources, the land and the property that lie within the bounds of that jurisdiction. But we've been walking that back ever since the Constitution was signed. Even before it was signed with the creation of the Bill of Rights, we began walking it back.
Yeah, there's been this steady encroachment about the powers of the federal government, definitely not limiting it to commerce, because everything touches commerce in some way. And so it had this ability to infect and give all these other powers to things that I don't think that was ever intended, especially if you read the rationale around the debates and some of the anti-federalist papers.
And the balance was added by the American people, or the discourse turning towards the judiciary and the legislative branches and saying, you know what, if we're going to give more of these national powers to the federal government, then we are going to rely on the judiciary and the legislative branches to provide or to mollify that centralization of control. But here we have Donald Trump coming in like a raging bull and embracing the government shutdown, and taking some of these powers that the Constitution and history give him precedence to seize. And so we have to begin to wonder, are the American people, and especially the states, going to begin to remember what the original powers that the federal government were limited to control? Are they going to begin to push back and seize that?
Well, we are seeing some of the governors start to do this. Certainly, Tim Walz, who was running against Donald Trump in the last presidential election. We see Gavin Newsom doing this in California. Assumably, both of these guys are still presidential hopefuls at some point. I don't know if this is them just continuing to stake their claim on that next run, or if it's because they really think that they're going to start to step up and assert the powers of the various states, or the authority vested in the states, to try to challenge what the federal government is capable of doing. I'm still looking for one of these states to actually say, we're just going to stop sending you money, and then see how that fight shapes up.
I also think that it's going to come down to that at some point. We're in the middle of the government shutdown. Donald Trump is using this shutdown to pursue some of his goals. Let's broaden this conversation and bring it to the present right now. I mean, over the weekend we had the ICE agents with riots in or pushback against ICE agents in Chicago, leading to riots. There was a shooting that involved a woman shooting at the ICE agents. I believe they shot her in return. We also had uh, the ICE agents facing off with Antifa over in Portland, and an interesting press conference with the chief of police from Portland, who said this is a city block and it's being blown out of proportion. I'm not surprised by that. We have the Trump administration, Donald Trump, trying to blow out to broaden um, the narrative of violence and problems inside cities, so that they have a reason to move federal agents into those cities. But as they do so, and as we see the ICE agents doing things like covering their faces, and Trump turning towards the military and saying, we're going to change the rules of engagement so that you're not hampered by considerations about who you're firing upon, and we're going to make a trial and error period in American cities for what this new military rules of engagement look like. You have to think that the likes of governors are very wary of what's coming. And when you say that Tim Walz and Gavin Newsom have an eye on the presidency, I don't know if they do. I think that we're going to see governors who say, um, the the president of the United States is relegated to commerce, and I want to continue to have the power over the people, the property, and the land within each state.
Well, I think that will largely happen if we see an erosion of presidential power, or if it looks like the erosion of presidential power is actually occurring. In times past, the the presidential office seemed to hold a tremendous appeal and a lot of value to people in politics that thought, this is where I move up to. I start as a whatever type of politician, move up through the ranks into Congress, maybe Senate, and then from Senate or as a governor, you launch into presidency or into the administration of a presidency. That seemed like the career path or the natural trajectory. If we do see this where the president really becomes way less important and the states start to significantly assert their rights, I think you're right that that governorship of a state starts to look like the top political post that you can aspire to, especially for states that are really strong economically. All these donor states, this is what I was referring to, is there are states who have economic output that where they give to the federal government less than they get back. These donor states, these largely blue states, I think when they start to assert that economic reality and say, we no longer believe that the federal government should be handing us back money and less than what we're giving to them. We know how to administrate this. We don't really need your help anymore. We'll just do it ourselves, especially if the bond rating of those states is higher than the United States.
Well, and when we begin to think about the position of the dollar, and how the federal government has uh, uh, forced its will and manipulated other countries around the world, and that system seeming to be on the threshold of ending. Um, I don't know that the president of the president of these United States is going to um, have the power that it's had in the past, either within what powers it assumes, what national powers it assumes within the United States, or what powers it has in controlling other countries around the world.
Historically, if you think about the United States, what was there a time when it looked more like this? Is there something that we could think about or point to when this office of the presidency was far more limited in scope? Do we have to reach all the way back to the early 1800s, or is there a time that you can recall that is a close parallel to what we might be approaching in our history?
So when I think about American history, there's this narrative that we had a war with the independence with England, and then we had the War of 1812. Nobody remembers what that was, but that was ostensibly another war of independence against England operating out of Canada. And then we had the Civil War. Um, when I think about the history of America, I think that if we begin to understand that we were never independent, and that states have other ways of controlling and manipulating countries, and especially democracies, then we can begin to question this autonomy that the United States tells itself that it got after the American Revolution. And when you begin to think about that, you can say, oh, this is why there has been a drift in the federal government towards national powers. The reason that the federal government has a border patrol, and assumes at that stitch in the social fabric that it can assume control of bodies, and habeas corpus is suspended, was because of the international waters on the eastern coast of the United States, and the impressment that was going on of American sailors in the War of 1812. So if fast forward from the War of 1812, whenever the states begin to say, oh, the people that we're ostensibly in control of, there's this gray area called international waters. We need to put the federal government in charge of those people and protecting those people there, and you can begin to see the creep of that national power into the federal government. Turn around to Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, and you see the attempts to try to write in control over the citizens through amendments, and it doesn't talk about habeas corpus, and it doesn't talk about becoming a national government, but it talks about the dual citizenship of every person within the United States. All of a sudden, they become citizens of the federal government, or of the United States, and citizens of their respective states. That's a that's some I don't know, some legal uh, that's some legal artifice. I'll put it that way. And then you think about the civil rights era. You see the federal government even extending more control over the property of the um, via the threads of commerce. But let's talk about the cathedral and constitutional monarchy, and the political theorist who is driving some of these ideas within Trump's administration, and with JD Vance, because there is a political thinker who has given them some of the ideas that we begin to see are more than just thoughts that they've been tossing around in their head, as Trump proceeds to fire a bunch, or proceeds to use the government shutdown in ways that we haven't seen presidents do in the last 30 years.
And who is this political theorist that we're thinking about? I'm going to throw it on the screen here.
Oh, grab it. Well, Curtis Yarvin. If our listeners are not familiar with Curtis Yarvin and his ideas of the cathedral, and also Nick Land's sort of dark enlightenment, these are two political bloggers, thinkers, who have been foundational um, in building Trump's sort of approach to tackle the deep state. And Curtis Yarvin believes in constitutional monarchy. He says that this reliance on democracy throws us into the hands of a journalist academia consortium, and he calls that the cathedral. And he says whenever we believe in democracy and this performative act of voting, and that's our political voice, then we are drawn into this theater of politics, while the real decisions get made, and the real decisions get made not in the legislative bodies, but they get made in the at Harvard, and in the New York Times, at institutions that are outside of democratic control. and he has a playbook for changing that, and that playbook includes the president of the United States, the executive of the federal government, to remember all of the ideas of how they were supposed to behave as a monarch, and to take control of the government, and to do things like fire all of the federal employees, and fire or retire the employees, and also to begin to remove the federal support of academic institutions. And if you think about what Donald Trump has done with the grants that get doled out to various academic institutions, and to the closures of the USAID and NED, National Endowment for Democracy, some of the funding channels that went towards supposedly we're supposed to be going towards media channels outside the United States, but as we learned, we're funding a lot of um, uh, journalism and media institutions within the United States, like the New York Times, like the broadcasting networks on television, and periodicals. Some magazines, the Atlantic Monthly, I believe, was one of them. You can see that he is operating directly from Curtis Yarvin's playbook for how to tackle this. And
So Trump is following the playbook that Curtis Yarvin laid out to attack this power base that has existed on the left, which is to bring out these ideas, to put ideas into the media. This is what Yarvin has said is the actual tendrils that have in like wrapped its arms around the republic and the democracy. And so this is the evidence here is that Trump is trying to lop these tentacles off and extract himself from what has happened here.
yes, and Trump, I mean, when Trump sort of shut the lights off on the federal government and then embraced it, I thought, oh, here we go. We're about to see this the firing of the federal employees, the broad retirement or firing of these employees. We had seen it. We'd seen it earlier in the administration with a lot of offerings of severance packages to some of these employees. Well, now they are going to leverage, bear more leverage on some of these federal bureaucrats and other employees to try to get them to move out of the federal government. And I am largely sympathetic to the ideas of Curtis Yarvin. I think that he is bang on correct with his assessment of the displacement of political decision making in democracies. I think that he's absolutely right that it occurs in especially academic and it, in the minds of policymakers and thought leaders
Does
within.
he does he at all make this the assertion that this is how these huge bills get authored seemingly out of nowhere and then suddenly they get voted on and no one really has a good sense of how did it get authored, where did it come from, who's actually cooking this stuff up? And I think many people have felt this that there are these 3,000 page bills that are getting passed that no one seems to be reading yet somehow are manufactured somewhere. Is Yarvin saying that this is where this stuff's actually coming from?
I mean, I haven't heard Yarvin address that directly, but I would say with his with his ground, he focuses a lot on the Roman Empire, the transition of the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, why that occurred, and I would say that he has read the Greek, a lot of the Greek thinkers, and it's nothing new that the faults of democracy are exactly the tactics that you lay out to flood the political to flood the forum with a lot of nonsense, to make a theater of non-important items, and then to go out off the stage and to make the actual political the hard political decisions. And I think that's exactly what happens in democracies. And the United States knowingly presses the creation of democratic states in other countries that we want to control around the world. We pay off the monarchies that we can't that we can't shuffle into a manipulatable democracy, and then here within the United States, um, uh, the power players are things that look more like monarchies, which are corporations. Uh,
So what does Yarvin actually push for? Is he push to say that the United States should actually move towards a monarchy? Is that the kind of thought
you know,
leadership that he's providing here and saying you shouldn't actually have a republic or a democracy, but rather some type of limited scope? You're electing a monarch for some period of time.
so Yarvin says that in the history of America, there have been presidents who acted as monarchs. Lincoln and FDR probably being the top of the list. Maybe George Washington, Lincoln, and FDR being the top of that list. And he says after FDR,
Because FDR was president for 4 terms. Is that when we actually had this limitation imposed that we would only have 2 terms after FDR?
yep, yes, in the wake of FDR, which I think FDR supported. Yarvin is of the mind that FDR understood that he had taken autocratic power within the United States. That was a something that was going on throughout countries around the world. That was necessary to address the differences of uh, the political friction between the many countries of the world. Of course, that was whenever we fought World War II, and Franklin D. Roosevelt, was an adroit politician. He made the decisions, and then he disseminated his decisions, and he was able to put forth the New Deal in the United States, which was a turn away from free market and a turn towards socialism, communism, whatever you want to call it, but a turn towards some of the sharing of the political pie within the United States without relying on an empire, growth outside of the jurisdiction of the United States. He also
Am I
thought,
remembering right that it was FDR that was the one that said a chicken in every pot? Is that the guy?
no, that
No,
wasn't.
that's somebody else.
No, that wasn't FDR. That was a lot older than FDR.
Okay.
No, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but that's a darn. I think that was actually British. Um, Maybe Asquith, who knows? But FDR also set up a lot of these federal bureaucracies, these executive bureaucracies, and Yarvin.
It was right before FDR. It was Hoover. So it was in the election
Oh,
right
it
before.
was,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and, which is interesting because Hoover offered put on the table a lot of the policies that would become the New Deal under FDR, but was he was less authoritarian than FDR. Hoover was sort of the Elon Musk of his day. He had made some mining drill that made him a bunch of money. He was part of the working class who worked his way up. FDR was from one of the greatest political families in the history of the United States, a swell from New York who was also, his mother, Delano, was a scion of an old shipping family. So FDR seizes the reins of the presidency of the United States and operates like an aristocrat and an autocrat, and so it's interesting how the effect that he was able to have in changing the political system of the United States, whereas Hoover, there's a there's a political school at Stanford that's named after him, but apart from that, he's not remembered well. Apart from Hoovervilles and the which we live in an America of Hoovervilles again, camps of poor people who can't afford housing and can't afford to eat and have drug dependencies throughout them. That was the world of Hoover, the world that FDR inherited. And so here we have Donald Trump again looking at some of those same problems and probably modeling himself more on becoming an FDR rather than a Hoover. going back to
Okay. Well, yeah. So a little bit of a tangent there on kind of the setup for have we ever had this? Are there times in the past? So going back to Yarvin, so he's hearkening back to these days to these political ideologies and saying this is the kind of thing that we need. We need a new FDR.
Yeah, and he talks about the constitutional monarchy and the president seizing all of these powers. When I think about that, and I think that Curtis Yarvin has been very involved in crypto, has been was also whispering in the ears of the likes of Sam Bankman-Fried and oh, now I can't remember Sam SBF's girlfriend's name. You might be able to. But anyway, whispering in the ears, he lives in San Francisco of a lot of people who've been around the blockchain and the crypto revolution. But when I think about what FDR was able to do, FDR was able to double down on the paper dollar and the erroneous notion of partial reserve banking and the gold reserves of the United States. And as we have better tools for understanding what the monetary systems of our government, what the monetary system of our government is, I'm not sure that Donald Trump is going to be able um, to to exactly follow the playbook of FDR. And so when I think about the things that Yarvin gets right, I think that he is right in governments governments operating more efficiently, better with a monarch, and uh, the circle of uh, the blame circle being shorter whenever there's a monarchy rather than being dispersed into academics and to journalists and other people who are making political decisions off the stage. I think Yarvin is right about that. But where I think he's wrong is this notion that it's going to be the executive of the federal government. I think where we're going to see this really take root is within the governorships of the several states, and we haven't seen anything. I don't think that we've seen a governor yet who's owned up or touted some of these ideas of Curtis Yarvin. But whenever they do, that is going to be an absolute a breaking threat.
I'm gonna challenge you on that one. I think that Tim Walz has actually operated in this exact way. So if you look at what happened during COVID, and I don't know how many people outside of this region really know what happened, but when COVID happened, Tim Walz was granted essentially monarch powers. Like the legislature stepped back completely, granted him emergency powers, and he operated as completely as a dictator of the state of Minnesota. He shuttered businesses, he told everybody what to do, and he operated well outside the bounds of the Constitution he of Minnesota. He was challenged on multiple fronts where people said that he was acting inappropriately and really assumed monarchical powers. So he's actually done this once. And it took a while for the legislature to actually wrest back some of that control because they said, well, we only intended to grant you this for a little while. And he said, well, I can yield it back whenever I want. Then I don't feel it's appropriate time to do so. And so there was a big fight in Minnesota for quite some time. So we've actually seen one governor do this, where the legislature actually stepped back and kind of granted him these monarchical powers. So we have seen it once already in our lifetime, and within the last 10 years.
I also saw Michelle Lujan Grisham of New Mexico operating, with a lot of autonomy and beginning to take the emergency, the emergency powers that were granted sort of without question by the people during COVID, and begin to take some of this idea of using emergency powers afterwards. We've seen Donald Trump do the same thing with his declaration of an emergency as being the backing for his tariff wars with other countries. So I'm not surprised to hear, especially Democratic governors, um, uh, leaning towards this broad interpretation, operating as constitutional monarchs in their various states. The Democrats are the original party of state power, and they fought the creep of national powers within the federal government through time. Thomas Jefferson was founder of the Democratic Republican Party, and he believed that the power should be at the state level. Um, and also, he believed in part that the Republicans who were engaging democratically were going to be stakeholders and own land, if not a threshold of property in those various states. So, and the Republicans are created by a contingent who were trying to use the federal government to usurp the national authority of the states to end slavery in the United States back in the 1860s. So I think that we are more like to see Democrats and blue states who begin to, especially to fight back at the federal government at the state level, and are going to have a lot more success. I also think about the
Well, wait,
uh,
let me jump in on this one, because I think that there's one other thing to watch for is when you start to see regional coalitions of states start to come together, where governors start cooperating amongst themselves outside the bounds of the federal government. I think that this is another one of those bellwethers or telltale signs that you're starting to see the breakup of the the, the United States. If you see that some regions start to operate within regional coalitions where you start to say, well, we're going to do this stuff and we don't need the coordination of the federal government to do it. That's when we're going to see these new countries start to be born. And I could see one happening here in the upper Midwest. If you think about the real political alignment that exists, you have these regions. And I think that there have been these attempts to draw boundaries around the United States and saying, well, there's probably like seven, maybe 13. Haha, some people will harken back to those days of the Hunger Games when there's like 13 districts in the United States. But some say that it's kind of seven boundaried areas that really have large political alignments, and that the 50 United States really don't have a good alignment. And this is where we're starting to see a lot of fighting between the states and regionalities, but they're kind of fighting across these boundaries.
well, I think in part this is why I find like the western states very interesting with their reliance on water from the Colorado River in such a dry area. And I think that agricultural cooperatives, the result of tariffs, of Trump's tariffs wars, have been a suppression of of the the sales of agricultural products, soybeans, wheat, corn, that are grown here in the United States. And
Well, that's a good point too, because we are seeing some governors start to push back on this, saying, well, if this is the way that Donald Trump wants to operate, then we're going to start cutting our own deals with these countries. We're not going to adhere to what is being negotiated by the United States, by the federal bureaucrats, and we're going to cut our own deals because we don't like the way it's being done. I think both California and Minnesota again have done these exact types of activities where they're negotiating directly with foreign entities.
well, and I think the Rust Belt, quote unquote Rust Belt states, up in the north, are going to be very interesting. The Democrats, in the wake of the takeover Republican control, they turn to unions to maintain their political power. Here in the world of today, and what were they not able to fight? They were not able to fight the national monetary system. As that national monetary system breaks down, and we also have technological innovations that say, begin to change what's possible for car, like a Henry Ford. What could Henry have Ford done with crypto back in his day? Be very interesting, and we're going to see it in the future. What is going to be?
Well, now
What are
that stable coin that was getting set up by Montana, that starts to look very interesting. We talked about this in the past, but if this is what's happening, we're starting to set up these regional currencies. Again, we're starting to see the breakdown of the United States as a 50-state conglomerate.
Well, and we've talked about state currencies, but what we haven't talked about is sort of what happens with the what we now think of international corporations, what's going to happen whenever we begin to see the distinctions between corporations that exist across states here in the United States, and also agricultural regions that exist across some of these political boundaries? I think we're going to begin to recognize and see them exert their power through their use of their own currency. And when I think about what might be the rails for what that's going to look at, I think about the Capper-Volstead Act, uh, which some agriculture sectors, I'm thinking about raisins and almonds, a lot of California producers have already organized through the Capper-Volstead Act in order to try to control the prices, to control the production of their various of whatever they're producing. And the Capper-Volstead Act was part of this New Deal, what would become the New Deal in the United States, in trying to address setting prices and controlling production. So if that's not done by the expansion of the monetary base and controlling prices that we've been seeing, which has been the monetary policy of the United States since FDR. I think we're going to see it through isolation and exchanges, and those are going to be piggybacked on currencies that are tied to like a wheat coin and a raisin coin, et cetera, et cetera.
These things are oftentimes really come to a head when you see some sort of a military conflict that blows up these ideas and makes them real in a visceral, boots on the ground way. The only thing that I see on the horizon that could rise to that level that might make all of this kicked off is actually the midterm elections. If what is happening with the federal government and ICE actually precipitates into a fight when the states go to vote, this is where you could see armed conflict between the federal government and the states actually arise. Because if the governors feel that ICE is materially interfering with a political process, with an election, that they could try to muster their own set of troops, and then we could see armed conflict between the federal government and the states. What do you think of that idea? And that might be the last thing that we've got, because we're almost running out of time here.
Well, I think that it actually is going to be more of an internal conflict, and that the military is also beginning to grapple with this and say, are we taking an oath to the Constitution, or are we taking an oath to the president? Because the military, the federal troops are comprised of people who grew up and have alliances and allegiances to various states and areas of these United States, and governors who begin to force the question of, are you acting on behalf of some supposed national electorate? Are you acting against the will of a smaller group of people? I think that's going to be a very hard ask for the military, and part of Trump's summoning of all the generals and his there's been a lot of hand wringing and fear about the moving from calling it uh, uh, the Department of Defense to the Department of War. I think part of that was understanding that it needs to see itself as the Department of War because it needs to be focused outside the United States. And that's that's setting the stage for it breaking up and saying, oh, wait a second. If we're actually a Department of War, then we're not stationed all around the world, supplying quote unquote defense, while we're really engaging in soft war that is levied not by even a lot of voted politicians, but actually by the cathedral that exists that exists off the behind the curtain on this political stage. So I think that's
It sure sheds a lot of new light on that meeting and what that might have really been about.
well. I think yes, it does. Yes, it does. And we are at the end of the episode, so we won't continue to beat that dead horse. But um, uh, we are at a time of great change in the United States. I think that Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and Curtis Yarvin are all concern and acting in hopes of making a better future of the United States, but we also have to be very wary of as these changes are made. We need to be wary about setting beginning to accept a shift as normal and what we want to see for the next 50 to 100 years. I hope that the answer to that, or the solution, is in decentralization in power. I think the governors of the states are the correct place to be looking. I do not want to see. I would hate to see us continue to rely on centralization of power in Washington, D.C. I don't think that's good for a lot of corners of America. So I'll end there.
All right. And with that, we'll see you next time on FOMO.